Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild character class, the Garradrugh, designed by Daylight Productions, aka Cameron Day, for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. Shoutouts to my platinum patrons, Andrew, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick, Andy, Chris, Alberto, and Manuel. And gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, Numa, Marcos Dade, Vicente, Gilberto, Sean A.K., Cert2B, Adam, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Arash, Lumpy Spuds, and Jerome. Thank you all very much for your support. A lot of times when I review new character classes, they're actually subclasses because it's a lot easier to develop a archetype or subclass on top of an existing class than it is to come up with an entirely new class. And that's because Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition already has a dozen classes. They pretty much cover just about every kind of character concept you could want. And so to go beyond that, a subclass is the much easier way to go. You can then add your own thematic concepts on top of that. So I don't see a whole lot of straight up new classes designed from the ground up, which is what this is. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying I have no idea how to properly pronounce the title or class of this product. I'm going with the Garradrugh because it is based on Celtic tree divination, which is like nature worshipping. And from what I recall from my minimal Celtic studies in college was they tend to have the GH, I believe, tends to be silent. You know, the Irene Gobra and all that. So I'm pronouncing it the Garradrugh, but hopefully the designer can point out how terribly wrong I am. We'll go from there. And unfortunately, it's a word I'm going to have to say a lot because that is the name of the product and the name of the new class. So the Garradrugh, as you can imagine, is nature-themed. It's basically a fighter with some nature-themed abilities. It's got a D10 hit dice, but it's not quite the combination of fighter and druid than I thought it would be, which, you know, going into D&D you think, well, fighter plus druid equals ranger, but that's really not the case. A ranger is a kind of a hunter, a big game warden. I guess you could, they've got, you know, druid type spells, but it's really not quite the concept of a druid. The Garradrugh is basically a more warrior-focused druid. The one unique thing they have is something called I'll have to attempt to pronounce this, a Beocrid, which is like a little sentient plant thing that accompanies you and can manifest as different kinds of things depending on which subclass you become. So since the Garradrugh itself is a class, that means it also includes its own subclasses, which in this case includes 6 different subclasses, depending on which tree theme you're going with. You can be of the oak, of the birch, of the yew, which is kind of a neat concept. Only about half of them I thought were particularly interesting, however, and we'll get to that in a second. You can see immediately that the formatting is not super attractive. I actually really like the background paper art used as kind of textured, weathered parchment paper. Looks really good. But the actual font, the text, and the way the pictures are inlaid is very, very, I guess amateurish is the word I would use. The problem is, none of this is particularly like awful or bad looking, but the TM's Guild throughout the years now has just really stepped up the bar when it comes to the professional presentation and the layouts that everyone uses. They all look so amazing. The problem is when you have one that doesn't follow a lot of those guides or layout outlines, it's noticeable in the other direction. Now, you know, the great ones are starting to look more normal, and then what was probably the normal looking ones are now starting to look worse because of that. So, I mean, if it looks like something I can whip up in, you know, Microsoft Word, that's not a good start. In this case, I mean, I still like the fact that it's not plain white background paper. That part's great. I do like this parchment, but the actual like tables, the font, the headings, none of that looks particularly good. There is some art, but you can see it's just basic like squares kind of placed in there. It doesn't look very good, and unfortunately, the black and white tiny pictures to go along with the subclasses do not contrast very well with the actual color art used throughout to depict, I guess, various characters that are playing as the Garradrugh. But text-wise, I think it's written fine. There are a few, there's no grammatical error, a few grammatical errors that I'm not going to even go over because it's not enough to warrant that. But there were a few kind of rules things that I felt like should have been a little more clear. For example, this planting strike, it says that it binds a creature to the ground, and they have to make a athletics check to break free. You need to really use the term are they grappled or are they restrained? You need to think about board game rule design, because RPG is a game. You have to think about game design and make sure you're very clear on rules and you use the proper terminology. So in this case, it just says you bind the creature to the ground. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean they are grappled? What does that mean in context of the mechanics of the game? There's a few of those here and there. It's not a whole lot, but just a few notes that could have been a little bit more clear. The biggest issue, first of all, they go into, at second level, it just says your Beocrid evolves to aid its host in combat, and it has never explained what the hell a Beocrid is yet. So there's an odd organizational issue here where it needed to have explained in the beginning, which, it does the good little intro. It's got the flavor text and kind of describes, you're a warrior, you've got this mystical grove. There's kind of these Highlander or Jedi Sith rules where it's there's only a certain amount of Garradrugh in the world that represent each of the different aspects of nature and the different kinds of trees. So that part's kind of a cool background. It kind of mentions you're almost like a dryad too. You tend to have suffered some kind of tragedy in your background, and there was some kind of race that I reviewed. It was a year or two ago, where you were a dryad who had its whole home scorched and destroyed, and you were just out for vengeance, a nature warrior of vengeance, essentially. But it talks about this Beocrid can evolve at second level into a combat ability, which is kind of like a fighting style, but that part is at least more interesting than a lot of fighting styles. You can have it evolve into another weapon in your offhand, and if you attack with that weapon, then it does poison damage. If you roll a 1 or a 2 on a damage dice with a two-handed weapon, then your Beocrid roots you to the ground, and you gain additional AC and resistance to non-magical attacks, and then you can do more damage on your next turn. So it kind of plays with existing fighting styles, are you using a one-handed weapon, are you using a two-handed weapon? But it has more interesting mechanics, which I do like that. That's nice. Even though I was like, what the hell is a Beocrid? And then you have to skip down to the next page, where it talks about the Beocrid's bond, and then it's okay, the Beocrid is some sentient plant thing that accompanies you. It has its own stats, and it can actually be attacked. And then what form it takes depends on your subclass, which that part's a little confusing because you don't gain your subclass until third level. So I'm not sure what it actually is supposed to look like until at second level. I guess you have it at first level, and then at second level it becomes a combat thing, and then at third level it takes the shape of what it should take. So there's an odd bit of there in terms of when are you supposed to get this thing. I think you're supposed to get the Beocrid at first level, and but I'm not sure why. At second level it's a combat, but at third level it takes its form. There's a bit of confusion there regarding how the Beocrids work, and just kind of things are a little bit out of order in terms of organizing how that all works. But I like the concept of this Beocrid thing changing form depending on which subclass you end up taking. And the subclasses, there's 6 of them. Half of them are pretty lame, which is disappointing. And by lame, I mean, off the top of your head, what is the most boring fighter? That was a Freudian slip. What is the most boring subclass combination? And the answer is a champion fighter, because a fighter is already, and again, much love to all the fighter fans out there. I know fighter is very useful. There's a lot of cool things they can do. But in terms of all the different abilities they can do, fighter is the easiest, the most straightforward. If you're a new D&D player, play a fighter. And if you're a really new D&D player and you make it to third level, probably, and you still don't want to do much else, frankly, play a champion, because all it does is makes you stronger, but you don't necessarily do a lot more. It's now you can crit more often, and you gain better skills, and I think higher initiative and that kind of thing. It's just not mechanically interesting, even though it does make you more powerful, but it's not very compelling in terms of, oh, at this level I get to do this, that kind of thing. And that's the case for about half of these subclasses, is you end up getting basically a better skill. Like you can add your charisma modifier to your insight skill, and you can add your charisma modifier to initiative rolls once per short or long rest. That's at 7th level, by the way, for the Bond of Birch. Let's see. And then the Fur and Hazel were both, you can just add, gain proficiencies in different skills. You can add to your armor class. You gain advantage in charisma skills. You can cast command a certain amount of times depending on your charisma modifier. It's just, thematically they're okay, and I like the idea of the Beocrid taking different forms. So it could be a glove, it can be a crown, it could be a mask, it can be a shield, which is the oak one, which that one is pretty cool because it all has to do with like defensive abilities. But just mechanically, they're not super interesting. So the base class itself, the way the Beocrid can work in combat is kind of nice, at least at the low levels. But I don't like any of the subclass abilities. The most interesting one, there's the 2 of the 6, which is the Bond of Ash, which is summoning. You can use your Beocrid to... it's a horn that you can summon. At 3rd level, you can summon a Wood Elemental, which is a new low-level elemental you can conjure, which a stat block is provided here. And then at 7th level, you can summon a pair of Dryads. And then you can use a lot of your abilities to heal. So it's all about summoning and healing. And that's really cool. That feels a lot different. That gives a fighter a lot more options, which is neat. And then the other one is kind of also a bit of summoning, the Bond of You, which is to do with death. So you gain the Toll the Dead cantrip. You can deal extra necrotic damage. You gain resistance to necrotic damage. You gain bonus AC. And I believe you can, you can cast Create Dead with charisma as your ability score. So those all feel not only thematic, but also giving you actually more abilities. Because you just think about when a party all levels up together, everybody's going around like, oh, I gained this 5th level spell slot. Oh, I can, wild shape into these new creatures. I can, I gain, I don't know, something more interesting. I gain new fighting maneuvers I can do. And then the lamest one is always the person who says, oh, well, my persuasion skill went up by 2. And that's kind of all that happened, and that's kind of what ends up happening for a lot of these subclasses, which is really disappointing and a bummer. But the base class is fine. Mechanically, I'm not sure. Balance is always the most difficult thing for me to comment on when it comes to, any of these products. Is obviously I'm not playing them, so it's hard for me to actually sit there and say this is imbalanced or this is finely balanced. I can give a ballpark, and a big deal, obviously, at 5th level for martial classes, for a lot of classes, is they gain multi-attack, extra attack. So, and again, if you're developing a new class, then you have to compare it to all the other classes. And in this case, the fighter, you're a D10. The closest comparison is a fighter, paladin, ranger. And they all gain extra attack at 5th level. The Garradrugh does not. Instead, at 5th level, it says that your Beocrid gains an attack action. Does that mean extra attack? I don't know. It's not very clear, but it just says as one of your attacks, you may fire a blast roll, a ranged spell attack, which is essentially a firebolt using your charisma, or Eldritch Blast, I guess, if you want to use that. It's a 1d10 force damage. So you gain a ranged attack. That's kind of cool. Or you can use your strength modifier to make a melee attack and essentially turn your Beocrid into you're like a symbiote, where it just becomes a tendril. You gain 10-foot reach and deal 1d6 piercing damage. That's most likely going to be worse damage for any fighter using a weapon, because you're probably using a d8 or a d10 or even a d12 weapon. You do gain some reach, so that could come in handy every once in a while. It's thematically cool, at least, to kind of grow a tendril out and attack. But I don't think any of that is as good as extra attack. But if it says Beocrid gains an attack action, does that mean you're getting extra attack as well as all these abilities? In which case, that probably balances it too much in the other direction, and you become way better because you get all these other abilities on top of it. So either it's not as good, or the rules aren't very clear about what kind of abilities you get. So it's hard for me to comment on the balance, other than it seems like maybe a little underbalanced, because so much of a fighter, ranger, paladin, so much of their abilities are going to be based around getting that extra attack in. Otherwise, it's a very thematic class. It's got some cool abilities to do with, plants. The concept of the Beocrid is pretty cool. It also, I have to mention, added a separate PDF, I guess at some point later, because the designer mentioned this was an errata, for multiclassing purposes, which is probably not what you think it is. So when you think multiclassing, you think, what are the rules? Like, what do you get, for example, if you multiclass into this character? And it's actually not mechanically at all. It is purely role-playing based. So in other words, if a character wanted to not start as a Garradrugh, but instead wanted to multiclass into it at some point during their adventuring career, and what this errata does is add 4 different ideas for becoming a Garradrugh, which is kind of cool. The funny thing is, obviously, the designer is a big comic book fan, and it takes a lot of the origin of superheroes into effect and then kind of applies it into how does that work for becoming one. So, for example, it uses an origin story for the Green Lantern, in which case one hero bestows their power because they're dying upon another hero, which I would make a joke about the Tim Allen's The Santa Claus, which is also kind of the same concept behind that one. The spoiler alert, Santa is killed in that movie. It's pretty dark when you think about it. And passes on the mantle. Actually, unwittingly, I believe Tim Allen just steals his robe and pants and becomes the new Santa Claus. In this case, you could you pass the Beocrid on and you become that new hero. So it's kind of a neat concept. It's not at all what I thought when they said multiclassing, but this whole thing needed to be integrated into the main sheet, and I also don't like how it uses a completely different background style, so it just feels like a separate product, when in fact it should have just been integrated into this first one. You get obviously both PDFs if you get this product, but that needed to be, what it should have done is been included as an extra role-playing note for the equivalent of an adventure hook for becoming a character class, which I think would be a really cool concept, and is kind of what that multiclassing thing does, which is, obviously there's notes for just starting off as a Garradrugh, then you can just have that part as your background, but if you want to become one, here are some quote-unquote adventure hooks or campaign ideas if your characters are interested in becoming more of this, militant nature warrior, for example, and here's some ideas, and then we took inspiration based on these classic comic book tropes. So it's not a bad idea, but it really should have been integrated into the into the actual main text in a better way. So I think that would have been a lot more interesting. Okay, let's go over my pros and cons, because it's pretty short, just the one character class of the Garradrugh. Pros: highly thematic combination of a fighter and a druid. I even hesitate to make that comparison. It's an easy one to make because nature, druid, a fighting class fighter, but it really is basically a fighter with some nature-themed abilities. It has no spellcasting whatsoever, but if you want to be nature and not cast spells, then you'd be looking at something like this. Pro: 6 different subclasses themed around different trees and tenants. That is pretty impressive that we got 6. Usually we have to wait for a Xanathar-style supplement to get that many subclasses for the other classes, even if, unfortunately, I only found about half of them to be very interesting. Cons: it's got an unattractive formatting and layout. If I can give one tip, always have a full color page for a cover. Don't make your product look like it's the first page of an article as part of a magazine, unless it is in a magazine. If it's its own standalone product, you really should have a full color page. It just looks a lot more cleaner, a lot more professional. And then the actual kind of text and the way art is inlaid in here could have been given a lot better of an upgrade as well. Cons: the multi-classing PDF really should have been integrated into the main text, and I would take the idea of here are the adventure hooks for becoming a Garradrugh and kind of integrated that better, and just overall a little better organized. With the Beocrid should have been mentioned at the beginning, what is that, and that would have really helped, because if you explain the adventure hooks and explain the Beocrid first and the concept behind that, then when you talk about the mechanics behind the Beocrid, then the player already knows everything behind it. So it's just some organizational issues. Final verdict: the Garradrugh could offer interesting role-playing opportunities for nature-themed warriors, but isn't significantly more interesting than a garden variety fighter. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.